So we comfy? Are we comfy, I said?
We're comfy.
Okay, well, thank you for being here. This is a big, serious, and important book, and I want to dig right into it. And Howard, I want you to talk a little bit about your visit to West Point.
Thank you.
So 2011, you're 58 years old. You're invited to West Point. I think you're 58, right, at the time? You're invited to West Point as part of a business leadership forum. Something happened there that changed your life. Tell us about that.
As you said, I was invited to speak at West Point about the subject of leadership. And in fact, I invited my family that day with me. I had never been to a military base and never been to an academy of any kind. I was struck the entire day I was there by the common characteristics and thread of integrity, ethics, patriotism, and the commitment to the country. And throughout the day, I felt as if I was being taught one lesson after another, not only about leadership, but about what it means to be a young American, and a young American who is deeply committed to the country in ways that are non-traditional compared to my son at the time, who was getting ready to go to college. And when it was time for me to speak about leadership later in the afternoon, I literally found myself at a loss for words. And I was at a loss for words because I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to speak about leadership when I had learned so many lessons from them that day. And so instead, it turned out to be a very informal and intimate conversation that I had with these elite young people. That started me on a journey that I did not prepare for, and it was unintended. A year and a half after that, I was very fortunate in being able to convince Secretary Gates to join the Starbucks board. And it was through his mentorship, friendship with me, that he sensitized me to the unusual aspects of the last 10, 15 years of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Over 2.5 million extraordinary young men and women have served, volunteered, and 1 million or so young men and women are entering civilian life. And the issue he was trying to, I think, persuade me to undertake and take a look at was that if we allow 6 months or a year to go by between now and the next 6 to 12 months, it's very possible that, not unlike Vietnam, that it'll be a distant memory of what these extraordinary people have sacrificed and have done so much for our country. This is a long-winded answer to a very brief question, and then I'm sure Rajiv's going to get into his side of it. But this is an unusual time in America with regard to these wars. Specifically, only 1% of the American population, more or less, has had skin in the game. And by that I mean very few of us know someone who directly has served. As a result of that, the difference between the military and the American society, the unintended consequences has been that people do not have a high degree of empathy because there hasn't been a high degree of understanding. And it would be a tragedy. It would just be unprecedented if we allowed this to happen, where the American people did not understand, appreciate, and empathize with the people coming home. So one of the things that we write about, and one of the things that I'm trying to get across to businesses and business leaders across the country, is that the veterans who are entering civilian life, it's our responsibility to try and help them find a job. It's our responsibility as Americans to help them ease back into civilian life. And they have assets and characteristics that are extraordinary and are so important to our society and businesses at large.
One of the things that struck me about this book, and I've read it now 3 times, it's really quite an extraordinary book. There are a lot of good stories in here, but the theme that seems to run through there is these are people who took personal responsibility for something, just as you did, Howard, going to West Point and being struck by the character of the people you met there, and then deciding to do something about it yourself. And Rajiv, I want you to tell the story of Justin Harder. Is that how he pronounces his name?
Jordan Harder, yeah.
Jordan Harder, who his mother said much later that he enlisted after 9/11 because he thought justice needed to be served. But a lot of us thought justice needed to be served. Not all of us enlisted. So What is it that drives the people in your book to take personal responsibility, and maybe you can help us understand that through his story?
Here was a young man who grew up on Long Island, who would happen to visit Lower Manhattan, go up in to visit the observation deck of the World Trade Center in late August of 2001. At the time, he was only a junior high school kid, but the events of that day affected him profoundly. And a few years later, when he was in high school, a chubby kid who liked to play lots of video games, pretty sedentary, decided his calling was to be a Marine, and he wanted to step up and defend his country in the wake of what had happened. Now, by that point, the war footing had shifted to Iraq, but he was a young man who wanted to join, and so he got himself physically fit, joined the Marines, went through basic training, and was assigned to an infantry battalion, and was shipped out to Iraq, to western Iraq, to a town called Ramadi, a very dangerous place at the time. And on his very first day there at his small outpost, he was assigned to man the front entry post. He was assigned to this entry post with another Marine from a very different background, a half-white, half-black young man who had grown up in rural Virginia, and he was on his last day on his deployment. The two of them had known each other probably for about 2 hours when, and inside their base, 33 fellow Americans were sleeping, as well as several dozen Iraqi police officers. A tanker truck rolls up at high speed toward their gate, ignores calls and shots from Iraqi police officers to stop, and weaves through the concrete barriers. And just in a matter of seconds, these two young men are confronted with a choice. They can run, and they'd later discover security camera footage of the gate. You could see an Iraqi police officer getting up from a plastic chair and just beating a retreat. These guys could have done that. Instead, they recognized that if that truck wasn't stopped, it would have plowed through the gate, detonated, and killed everybody inside. So these two men who had known each other for 2 hours, but were both U.S. Marines, stood shoulder to shoulder and fired at the truck to try to stop it, knowing, we can only believe, that they would be giving their lives to do that, and they did. The truck blew up, killed both of them, but saved everybody inside that outpost. And this is the sort of story, these are the sorts of acts by these brave men and women that just don't get enough attention back home. Back during the Second World War, David, as you know very well, our government trotted around our Medal of Honor recipients around the country because we needed to sell war bonds, and their stories of their heroism were woven into the American national narrative back then. Today, yeah, there may be an award ceremony at the White House, and in the case of these two young men, they didn't even get the Medal of Honor. So there may be a little ceremony on a base, it gets a little bit of attention, but really, nobody pays attention anymore. I mean, if you walk down the street today and you ask somebody, can you name one single living Medal of Honor recipient from these two wars? 99% of the time, you'll get a blank stare.
So here's my devil's advocate question. Why should we care? I mean, we decided as a country back in 1973, we don't want the burden of military service. We want to pay people to do this for us, right? So now we have an all-volunteer force. The people who go to war because they volunteered. The rest of us have no obligation to do that, and there's no penalty for not doing so. So what is it that we owe people who serve? Why is that so important, and why have you gone to the great length of writing this book to try to reach us with that?
We owe them some understanding of who they are and what they've done. The all-volunteer force that we have is a great thing. It's given us the best trained, best disciplined Army in our history. Howard and I aren't sitting up here saying, bring back the draft, not by any stretch of the imagination. But it's dangerous for society to become disconnected from the people who protect it. And we all have an obligation, even though, yes, they signed up, they volunteered, they get paid to go and do that. But they take a great risk and make amazing sacrifices, away from home for a year at a time, often multiple deployments, facing the threat of injury, the reality of serious injury. We owe it to them. We owe it to ourselves as a nation to understand who they are, what they're doing, and equally importantly, David, what they have to offer and what they are offering once they come home. Because there's this stereotype that has come up around our veterans today. Even though we applaud for them at sporting events, that we say thank you in airports and so forth, there are a lot of people out there who think this is a group of Americans who are battered, who are all hurt, who are all ticking time bombs. There's a stereotype of pity that surrounds them. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Yes, there are many who are struggling with their transitions, who are having trouble finding jobs, and leaders like Howard, business leaders, are doing remarkable things in that regard, and that needs to continue. Some are struggling with physical and mental challenges. We take nothing, we don't shirk away from that. But there are many others who are having remarkable transitions, who are coming back and using and plowing their leadership skills, their problem-solving talents, their values and ethics into initiatives to help strengthen and rebuild our country. And that has to be recognized and celebrated.
I think also the American people and the government has made a solemn promise, irregardless of a draft or an all-volunteer service, to take care of veterans when they come home. I would submit, unfortunately, that I believe the government does a much better job of sending people to war than they do bringing them home. Your question, though, brings up another issue. I mean, a year ago, during the government shutdown, there was a provision that just absolutely stunned me that there wasn't such an outcry from the American people, and there wasn't. And that was during the government shutdown a year ago, veterans lost their death benefits. Families lost their death benefits. Now, when you ask why should we care, I think it's about the conscience of the country and the humanity of the American people. We are a very diverse society. A month ago, there was a poll on a number of public institutions. And it's very predictable that the Congress of the U.S. government was at the lowest level. But the most trusted entity of any in the United States of America today is the U.S. military. And you have to ask yourself why. Because it is supposed to be an apolitical organization. And I must tell you that in every conversation that Rajiv and I have had across military bases across the country, at the Pentagon, at Walter Reed, we have never had a conversation with either an enlisted person or a four-star general where they were discussing politics or the fact that we were going to war. What they were here to tell us is they had a mission, they were given orders, and they were going to execute it as best they could. And they were going to risk their lives for us. That is why we must care.
Wow, good answers. And I stress, again, that was a devil's advocate question. Howard, talk to me a little bit about character. I mean, you saw something when you went to West Point that day. You saw something instantly that I call character. Talk a little bit about character. What was it that you saw, and what do you see as so important in this generation of veterans that's important to you as a business person here at home?
Well, I think the backdrop of that question for me is the dysfunction and the polarization of Washington, irregardless of yesterday's election. That we all, I think, as Americans, can sense that there is a void of leadership in the country and that we are longing for something that we once had. When you see it up close and you are around it, it's so blatantly obvious that character, authenticity, truth rules the day. And it's something you can't fake. I saw it at West Point, and I've seen it at every military installation that we have visited. I had the Medal of Honor recipient in my office, Sergeant Petrie, less than a year ago. And his story, like many others, is about heroism. He had a grenade that went off in an area that he was. Men were injured. Another one came in. It was about to explode. It would have damaged and caused tremendous pain and sufferings to others. He picked up the grenade, and he was getting ready to toss it to the other side, and the grenade exploded in his hand. He received the Medal of Honor as a result of that. In my office, and he's telling me this story, and this goes back to your question. He says to me, Mr. Schultz, I have to explain something to you. I'm no hero. I was just doing my job. Now, when you hear that, there's no cameras, there's no PR, there's no marketing. That's character. That's truth. That's authenticity. And when you see it, you know it. The country needs more of it. And the veterans who are entering civilian life demonstrate it day in and day out. And they deserve to be embraced in a way that I don't think most Americans understand. That's why we wrote the book, and that's why we're having this epic concert on Tuesday outside at the National Mall on national TV with HBO and Chase, and I think we're going to do something for the country that hopefully starts a national conversation and an enduring understanding of these issues.
So, Rajiv, how do we move into practical ways? Lots of people support the troops. I think there's a great amount of goodwill towards serving military and veterans. But how do we move beyond the bumper sticker, support the troops, and what can we do, practically speaking, to close the gap between us and our veterans?
I agree with you that there's a lot of goodwill out there. But I would also posit that a lot of that goodwill is kind of superficial. It's a little bit rote. We say thank you for your service. We applaud because we think it's the right thing to do. And it is the right thing to do. I don't mean to suggest for a moment that it isn't. But how much do we really know about the people we're celebrating? And there's a danger to our society that, that rote behavior could easily fade away. And then what happens? And what happens to these men and women who, for those who are injured, who will continue to need support and care from our government? We've made solemn obligations to them. And the fulfillment of those obligations come from an engaged citizenry that knows what they've done and respects what they've done. So we're not out here to say, open up your wallets, go home and pack a care package tomorrow. But it's about learning and engaging and reconnecting. It's about having a national conversation or a community conversation or just a one-on-one conversation. Don't let the discussion end with thank you for your service. That should be the beginning. When you encounter somebody who has served, take some time to understand who they are, their experiences. Not all of them may want to talk, but many do. And be willing to engage and come away with a deeper understanding. We also think one way to do that is through this book, if I may be so humble. I mean, what we're trying to do is essentially recreate some of the conversations that took place in our society during those years when lots of people served and there was a shared national understanding. In 1946, the sorts of stories we write about were shared over dinner tables across America. But because so few Americans serve, and it is a direct experience and connection to so few families, people don't know about these stories of both heroism. They also don't really know about how members of this generation are doing these remarkable things back home. And we're lucky to be joined in the audience here today by a remarkable man, a former Army Lieutenant Colonel David Aucklander, who spent 20-plus years in the Army. He commanded 1,000 paratroopers in Afghanistan. He came back to the Pentagon, and he was sitting in his office, and he had a classified secret computer system, and he had an unclassified one, and on his classified one, he was seeing daily reports of casualties in Afghanistan. On the unclassified one, he was seeing stories of, particularly of gun violence in Chicago, where he had spent some time growing up. And he came to understand in 2011, before people on the outside did, that we would lose more young people to gun violence in Chicago than we would lose American troops at war that year. And so he said, I need to do something about this. And he left the Army, and with no teaching credential, with no classroom experience, he decided he was going to become a teacher. And now he's on track to become a principal of a charter school in inner city Chicago. That's the sort of remarkable contribution this generation of veterans are making that really gets lost in all of the chatter and fray in our country.
One more quick question about the economy. I looked at the statistics for unemployment among veterans. It's actually going down for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. I think it's gone down in the past year from about 10% to about 6%, which is great. So my question is there still a need for good jobs for veterans? Do we still need to do more? Do we need to pay more attention to that? Or are there a lot of veterans who have jobs, but they're underemployed and underutilized for the talents that they have? Do you have any sense of that?
It's the first time I heard 6%.
Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Okay, I believe you. It's still a very large number, and it's still a big issue.
Of course, those are the ones seeking jobs. We know there are a great many veterans who just aren't in the job market. So.
Yeah. Let me tell you what we've experienced at Starbucks and why it's so important. There are thousands of veterans who are coming back into civilian life who very much want to belong to an organization in which it can be larger than themselves. More often than not, the veteran that is coming back into civilian life has not had a typical job experience for quite a long time. Some have never had a typical job experience, have never had a resume, and in fact have never been in a typical job interview. We heard one young enlisted person say, and this is another, I think, kind of statement that really sets you back when you hear someone say, I have more anxiety and trepidation about going to a job interview than I have going back to Afghanistan. So when you hear that, you need to understand what's behind it. More often than not, the job skills and the experience that someone who has served during these wars has been through a great deal and has so much to offer a company. However, his or her set of skills probably does not match up in perfect symmetry to the job. If there's a recruiter inside the company, and we've done this at Starbucks, who has been a veteran, understands the common language, understands the skill base, there is a much easier opportunity to create the right fit. We also have an Armed Forces network at Starbucks that acts as a mentor to lots of veterans that come in the company. And I think the secondary benefit, I think this is important, the culture of our company and the values of our company and the pride has risen greatly as a result of people working alongside a veteran who has demonstrated so much to the country and now to the company. So this is still a significant need, and businesses and business leaders need to understand the opportunity. It's not charity, it's not pity, it actually is very good business.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It sounds like you're doing some great stuff at Starbucks. I appreciate it. Okay, folks, I'm going to open this up to questions, and if you please raise your hand and wait, I think someone will approach you with a microphone, and you may speak.
Hi, thank you for coming. This is my question for Howard. Do you plan on working with other leaders in corporate America to create programs to transition veterans into their companies and whatnot?
We are actively, one of the reasons that we're on this book tour is to solicit the support of other companies and other business leaders. I've had the opportunity to talk to Tim about this a number of times, and I know AOL and Huffington Post are very supportive. We're also, through our family foundation, creating transitional job skills with other companies on bases across the country. So this is an opportunity, I think, for us to tell this story and solicit the support of other companies. And the fact that HBO and Chase have stepped up in a big, big way to join us and produce this concert on Tuesday night is another example of companies, I think, embracing the cause. And that'll be another opportunity to solicit the support of major corporations across the country.
Come on, folks. You don't often get a chance to talk to two experts. Yes, right here. My question's for Rajiv. Just wait for the microphone for a sec.
My question's for Rajiv. I know your last book was a fairly in-depth account of the war in Afghanistan, and prior to that, you wrote Imperial Life in the Emerald City on what happened in Iraq. What compelled you to pivot to the domestic side of things as a war correspondent, to go from here's what's happening on the front lines to now what's happening back home? Was that just the natural progression of the story as a journalist, or was there something more for you?
Thank you for that question. After having spent 2.5 years in Iraq, the better part of 3.5 going back and forth to Afghanistan, and really being kind of immersed in the war experience, I felt that I was in some ways disconnected from the experiences of the men and women that I had spent time with out there, their experiences now that they were back home. And quite frankly, it wasn't until last fall when I was working on what would become a landmark survey of post-9/11 veterans conducted by the Washington Post and the Kaiser Family Foundation that gave me the opportunity to travel around the country and do a lot of face-to-face interviews with this generation of veterans, that I came to understand that I was, even though I'd spent all this time with their brethren at war, that I was really not fully aware of both the challenges as well as some of the remarkable successes that were taking place among my fellow citizens who had served. And so it was at that point when I started to feel that way that I happened to link up with Howard. And so we came to this with different backgrounds, but when we came together, we both had a similar sense of purpose. And there was a finding in that survey that really resonated with the two of us. 55% of this generation of veterans feel disconnected from civilian life in America. We asked ourselves, how can that be? And we both immediately concluded that was unacceptably high. Nobody who goes off to war for our nation and comes back should feel disconnected from the society that they were protecting. And that then led to this shared desire to want to bridge the civil-military gap in our society, and that's why we've done this. So I see it as a natural progression from everything that I've done out there to now bring the story back home, because the war is really now here at home.
In addition to the thank you for your service or writing a check, which is relatively easy to do, are there organizations that you become impressed with, or other suggestions you have for an individual who wants to contribute more personally to veterans?
So we write about several of them in the second half of this book. The first half are stories of heroism that take place in Iraq and Afghanistan. The second half are stories of kind of heroism on the home front. And we tell the story of a couple of different organizations that have been started and are run by this generation of veterans that are entrepreneurial, that are service-focused. And I'll tick off a couple of them. There's an outfit called Team Rubicon that we write a chapter about that harnesses veterans to pitch in after natural disasters in our country. This past summer, a wave of tornadoes swept through the areas of Arkansas north of Little Rock. Well, a couple of days later, you had dozens of veterans who showed up, who had just thrown their backpacks with clothes in the back of their pickup trucks and drove down and pitched in to help, sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks. And because these are folks who are used to living in adverse conditions, can sleep under the stars, are trained to do hard work. And we write about another outfit called Team Red, White, and Blue, which started to organize veterans to engage in kind of physical activity, to go on road races and kind of evening runs around their communities around the country. Well, they have morphed now into an organization that attracts civilians as well as veterans, and they have just as many civilians as they do veterans in their ranks. And it's a great example of how ordinary people can connect in their communities. Just going for a 3-mile run on a Wednesday night, as takes place in Bethesda, Maryland, with one chapter, is a great way for people who have no military background to get to know people who have perhaps come back from Iraq or Afghanistan. These are groups that connect via social media. That's how they've sort of expanded and grown. And they're dynamic, and they're of this generation. This is not a generation that wants to spend their weekends in smoky VFW halls. This is a group of young Americans who put their hands up to serve. These are people who made an affirmative choice to serve. They come back home, they still have that service spirit, and in many cases they reconnect through aspects of community service. Pretty remarkable.
In that regard, I might note that in this country, There are 43,000 community organizations dedicated to helping veterans, and many of them need volunteers. So they're everywhere, and I think you can, if you look hard, you can find opportunities to get engaged there as well.
Hi. Was this on? Sorry. Hi, I'm wondering what countries, if any, we can look to that are doing a good job with veteran relations and just with veterans in general.
Rajiv, you're the expert.
Well, I have to say, I don't think there are any great models out there. Look, there are countries where there is compulsory national service, where there is a greater sort of tradition of having people who spend time in the military and war and a more common understanding. I would think of a country like Israel, for instance. But when you look at some of our allies who have fought in Afghanistan with us, European countries, for instance, they're struggling with some of the very same stuff we are. And I think in Britain, for instance, because Prince Harry went and served and flew Apache helicopters, there was perhaps a little bit more attention paid to aspects of the Afghan war than there might otherwise have been from sort of a celebrity focus. But when you look at Britain, at France, at Germany, at Australia, all of these countries who have committed troops over the past years in Afghanistan, they too are struggling. But we have sent far more men and women, and I think as a global leader, we have a special responsibility to sort of show the way.
I would just add one thing to that. I don't think that we can rely on the government to do the things necessary that we as Americans can do. I think the government, as I said earlier, has a solemn responsibility to do everything they can to the VA and other organizations. But I think we're talking about something else, about respect, about honor. And I would hate to think that we didn't learn at least one lesson from Vietnam. And that is, veterans came back from Vietnam, and not only were they vilified, which is not the situation today, but they were not in any way respected. And as a result of that, they were left behind and became cracks in our society. We have a homeless problem with veterans. We have a suicide problem with veterans. Certainly there's a PTS issue and brain trauma. And so I think as Americans, we need to embrace them and do the things necessary, but not as charity or pity, the recognition that they can bring so much to our greater society and to the private sector.
In fact, I think I read through the book the whole way through without seeing the words VA. And the thrust of the book is not, we need the VA to do more, it's that we need to do more. Yeah.
Time for one more question.
Howard and Rajiv, my name's Derek. Just want to echo this sentiment and say thank you for telling the story that a lot of veterans that I know have been asking people to hear in this world. And so I appreciate you communicating that. Also, thank you for telling Lance Corporal Harder's and Corporal Yale's story. I deployed with them on my first deployment to Iraq, and that's a day I'll never forget, the day that they were killed. Lastly, applaud your efforts for reaching out to the corporate community and generating this awareness. But my question for you is, on the same token, a lot of the veterans that I know currently aren't interested in going to a corporate role. They're interested in entrepreneurial activities. And one of the biggest things I've found in my own journey is that there's beginning to become more support, entrepreneurial, for these veterans, but there's still limited funding, and especially at the seed and early venture stages. So my question is have you guys seen any sort of corporate support for entrepreneurial activities, specifically for veterans, in your travels and your writing this book?
Well, first off, I know your story very well from Zach, and it's not enough for all of us to thank you for your service, but I think you're an extraordinary person who has done so much for the country. Thank you very much. I think your question about entrepreneurial efforts and seed funding, I think one of the things that we have to try and do is segregate and segment the venture community. And as the same token that we're asking business leaders to entertain and hire veterans, we have to do the same thing on the seed level of educating and creating a dialogue with venture funds across the country about veteran-based startups and entrepreneurial efforts. And I think the venture community will be very open to that. Now, I'm sure you understand the fact that every business, whether it's veteran startup or not, has to pass the smell test and be the kind of business that's going to make a profit. But I think the venture community will be quite open to that. And I think on a personal level, I can help you, if you have a startup or an idea, get in front of the right people.
Question.
Hi, first of all, thank you, and it's incredible what you're doing. I'm also a civilian who tries to help veterans, but I had a quick comment to pick up on something you said, and then a question. Howard, you spoke about the government shutdown, and I'm involved in a nonprofit organization that works with veterans at military bases using filmmaking, but I was actually at Fort Bragg during the shutdown last summer, and when the shutdown occurred, we had like 30 soldiers that were doing our program and a dozen civilians and military that were supporting us, and all of them showed up. All of them showed up to participate in the program and to help it happen. And I just thought, when you speak about character, that's what it's about. This is the kind of thing that wins battles. You know, this is what wins wars. And I just wanted to point that out. The second thing was just picking up on a few different comments. You said your own introduction to the military was very much by chance in your 50s. I happen to be an Army dependent of many generations, so mine came through that way. But for most people, it isn't so much that we're in the Vietnam generation where people don't want to support veterans and are spitting on soldiers returning home. It's just that the younger people that are the same age as those deploying don't have a way in. They don't know. I have a lot of folks that work with me, and they're thrilled when they find the opportunity or the context to work with veterans. So my concern is, my hand is shaking. That's because maybe it's either too much coffee or something. I'm not sure what. But anyway, my concern, and I guess sort of hope, is that building on a book like this in a generation of the YouTube generation where people don't jump out and read books all the time, and I downloaded it, but it's a different generation. You need different tools to engage these civilians, and you do have a number of stories in the last in the epilogue particularly, about Team Rubicon and about if you're a veteran, if you're a corporation, if you're an individual. But I do think that the focus needs to be, I mean, the veteran's doing everything he can, but the focus needs to be on finding ways to engage the other 99% and to give them context in which to engage our veterans. And hopefully there are ways that you can extend the value of what you're doing here in this book. I think there's a question in here to do that. And I just sort of, Starbucks is the kind of company that can do it because you're a household name. And I just wonder if there are thoughts on that, or maybe what might happen after this book goes off being #1 on the bestseller list, which I hope it is. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for your comments and the question. You know, I think I can assure you of one thing. This book, the concert, our family foundation, we are going to stick with this issue. This is going to be an enduring commitment and obligation from us and a number of people. And I think this is about leadership, but it's also about engaging the rest of society. I mean, yesterday's election, whether you're Republican or Democrat, half the country did not vote. So it's not only engaging on this issue, is how can we recreate a society that is engaged, that is informed, and that if you are unhappy with the situation, you let your voice be heard. I mean, so it's not only about this issue. This issue, I think, is systemic of lots of issues in which the American people have turned away from. Our responsibility as leaders, and as with all of us, is to do everything we can to engage in the subject matter that's most important, to improve the lives of people who are being left behind, whether they're veterans or not, and make sure this is the country, the American dream, and the American promise that our parents and our grandparents gave to us. And right now, I think we've got a lot of work to do. Thank you.